The old music hall smelled of dust and polish, a scent he knew as well as his own home. For Leo, this place was more than just a building. It was the keeper of his memories. Years ago, he was the one in the spotlight, a violinist with a bright future stretching out before him. Audiences would lean in, captivated as his bow danced across the strings. But that felt like a lifetime ago. Now his world was made of different sounds, the slow, careful scales of a student, the gentle corrections, the repetitive rhythms of someone just learning. He was still a good teacher, patient and kind. But if you listened closely, you could sometimes hear a quiet sigh escape his lips, a small signal of a dream that had been gently packed away. He heard the same mistakes day after day, and while he never showed frustration, a part of him had grown a little tired, a little numb to the magic he once felt. One Tuesday evening, as the community orchestra members were trickling in, laughing and unpacking their instruments, the director called for everyone's attention. "Everyone settle down, please," he said, his voice echoing in the hall. "We have a new member joining us tonight." All eyes turned to the young woman standing slightly behind him. She seemed to shrink under the gaze of the group. She was quiet, with a shyness that made her seem younger than she probably was. She held her cello case in front of her with both hands, gripping the handle tightly as if it were the only solid thing in the room. "This is Ilara," the director announced with a warm smile. "She'll be joining the cello section. Let's make her feel welcome." A soft murmur of hellos rippled through the group. Ilara offered a small, nervous smile but didn't say a word. She just gave a quick, slight nod of her head. The director scanned the room and his eyes landed on Leo. "Leo," he said, "you're our most experienced strings player. Would you mind keeping an eye on Ilara? Help her find her way through the first piece?" Leo felt a familiar feeling. It was a mix of duty and a small, private disappointment. He had seen this before. A new, quiet student. A cello that probably hadn't been played much. He assumed she was a beginner, someone who loved the idea of music but was still struggling with the reality of it. He prepared himself for the slow process of explaining the basics, of helping her find the right notes, of listening to the hesitant, scratchy sounds of a new player. He walked over to her, putting on his kindest, most encouraging teacher's face. "Welcome, Ilara," he said. "It's great to have you with us. Don't worry about keeping up. Just focus on getting comfortable." She looked up at him, her eyes a little wide. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. The rehearsal began. Leo kept glancing over at her. She didn't take her cello out of its case right away. Instead, she just sat there, her eyes fixed on the sheet music on the stand in front of her. It was a challenging piece, one that had tricky passages even for the experienced players. When the cello section began to play, Leo noticed she simply rested her hands on her case, her fingers moving silently along its surface, as if she were practicing the fingerings on an invisible instrument. He thought it was a sign of a lack of confidence. He felt a pang of sympathy for her. During a break, he approached her again. "It's a tough one, isn't it?" he said gently. "That middle section is very fast. Don't be afraid to just play the root notes at first until you get the hang of it." She looked at the music, then back at him. "I will try," she said quietly. He gave her a reassuring smile. That's all anyone can ask. For the next 2 weeks, this was their routine. Leo would offer small pieces of advice. Make sure your bow hold is relaxed, or try to listen for the harmony from the violins. Ilara would always accept his suggestions with a quiet, "Thank you," or a nod. She never played loudly enough for him to truly hear her during the full orchestra rehearsals. Her sound was always swallowed by the other, more powerful instruments. He never saw her outside the music hall. Her cello case was plain and worn, with a few scratches and a faded sticker from some long-forgotten place. It looked perfectly ordinary, like the instrument inside was a faithful but simple companion for a beginner. To Leo, she was a sketch, not a full picture, a quiet, shy girl who loved music but was still finding her way. He had a whole box of assumptions about her, and he never once thought to open it and look inside. He was the teacher and she was the student. In his mind, the roles were set and the story was already written. He had no idea that the first page of the real story hadn't even been turned yet. The following week, the rehearsals settled into a new rhythm with the new cellist as a part of them. Leo, true to his word, made an effort to guide her. He saw it as his role, a small duty he had to perform. He was always kind, always patient, but a certain distance remained. He was the experienced guide, and in his eyes she was the traveler who had just started her journey. He would often watch her from his seat in the violin section. She was always one of the first to arrive, slipping into the rehearsal hall without a sound. She would carefully unpack her cello, a process that seemed to take her a long time. She would check every peg, tighten the bow with great focus, and rub a small amount of rosin onto the hair, her movements slow and deliberate. Leo saw this not as the ritual of a professional, but as the nervous preparation of someone who wasn't sure of her own instrument. During the pieces, when the entire orchestra was playing, he could barely hear her. The sound of her cello was a soft, whispery tone that got lost in the wave of sound from the other, more confident musicians. Sometimes he would see her bow moving, but it seemed hesitant, as if she was afraid to make a mistake. He noticed that when the music became very complex and fast, she would sometimes stop playing altogether. Her fingers would hover over the strings, tracing the shapes of the notes in the air, but without making a sound. He decided she was just overwhelmed. He made a point to walk over to her during a break. She was sitting alone, looking at the sheet music for a difficult section they had just attempted. "That part is a real challenge, isn't it?" Leo said, giving her a warm smile. "Even some of our seasoned players struggle with that run of notes. Don't worry about playing every single one. Maybe just focus on the first note of each measure. That will help you stay with us." She looked up from the music, her eyes meeting his for a second before looking down again. "I understand," she said softly. "Thank you." "It will come with time," he added, trying to be encouraging. "The most important thing is to not get discouraged." She simply nodded, her gaze returning to the complex dots and lines on the page. She didn't seem discouraged, he thought. She just seemed deeply focused. Another time he tried to make conversation. "That's a nice-looking cello you have," he remarked, though in truth the case looked old and well-used. "How long have you been playing?" It was a simple, friendly question, but she seemed to think about it for a moment, as if calculating the answer. "A while," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. Then, as if to avoid more questions, she quickly added, "The tone of your violin is very beautiful." The compliment took him by surprise. "Oh, thank you," he said, patting his instrument. "We've been through a lot together." He wanted to ask her more, but her closed-off posture and her quietness built a wall around her. He decided not to push. He assumed she was just very shy. He started to form a story about her in his mind. He pictured her practicing in a small apartment, maybe a college student who had played in her high school orchestra and missed it. He imagined her cello was a family hand-me-down, decent enough for a beginner, but nothing special. Her silence, he believed, was a lack of confidence. Her careful, quiet playing was a fear of being heard and making a mistake. He never saw her talk much with the other musicians. She would pack up her cello the moment the rehearsal ended, give a small, polite wave to anyone who made eye contact, and then disappear out the door into the evening. She was like a ghost in the music hall, present but not fully there. Leo's advice to her remained gentle and basic, the kind of advice you'd give to someone who was still learning the language of music. "Remember to keep your wrist relaxed on that down bow," or "try to feel the pulse of the music from the conductor." And she would always respond with the same quiet, "Thank you. I will try." He felt a sense of pity for her, mixed with a teacher's pride in being helpful. He was so sure of the picture he had painted in his head, the kind, experienced mentor helping the timid beginner, that he never stopped to consider if the picture was accurate. He never wondered why her fingers, when they danced silently over the fingerboard during the most complicated passages, never seemed to land on the wrong, imaginary note. He never questioned why her eyes, when they scanned the music, held a look of deep understanding, not one of confusion. He was listening for the sound of mistakes, and because she made none that he could hear, he assumed she was just playing it safe. The truth was, he wasn't really seeing her and he wasn't really listening. He was just seeing and hearing his own assumptions, and all the while the real musician, the one hiding in plain sight, was waiting quietly for her moment. The night of the big storm started like any other rehearsal. The sky had been a dull gray all afternoon, and there was a heavy feeling in the air. People arrived at the music hall with jackets pulled tight, making comments about the weather. Leo came in, shaking a few drops of rain from his coat. He noticed the new cellist was already in her usual spot, looking out the tall window at the darkening clouds. The conductor, A cheerful man with a lot of energy clapped his hands to start the rehearsal. But as the musicians began to tune their instruments, the sound of the wind grew louder. It whistled around the corners of the old building. Then the rain started. It wasn't gentle rain. It was a sudden, angry downpour that hammered against the roof and the windows like 1,000 tiny drums. For the first 20 minutes, everyone tried to focus. But the storm was a powerful distraction. The lights in the hall flickered once, then twice, causing a nervous ripple through the orchestra. A few people jumped. The sound of the music was fighting a losing battle with the sound of the storm. Then the conductor's phone buzzed. He looked at it and his face fell. He held up his hands for everyone to stop. "I'm sorry, everyone," he said, his voice raised over the noise of the rain. "That was the city. They've issued a severe weather warning. They're advising everyone not to travel. For everyone's safety, I think we have to cancel the rest of the rehearsal. Please pack up carefully and get home safely." There was a wave of disappointed murmurs. This was a crucial rehearsal for their upcoming concert, and now they were losing valuable time. But everyone understood. One by one, and then in small groups, the musicians packed their instruments, pulled on their coats and headed out into the wild night, calling out good night and see you next week. Soon the huge hall felt enormous and empty. The only people left were the conductor, who was gathering his scores at the front, Leo, who was slowly putting his violin away, and the quiet cellist, who was standing by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The conductor walked over to Leo, his shoulders slumped. "What a shame," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We really needed to work on the second movement tonight. The entire feeling of the piece rests on that slow, beautiful cello solo at the beginning, and our principal cellist just left. Without that melody to guide us, the rest of the orchestra doesn't know how to shape their parts." He looked out at the nearly empty room, his expression full of frustration. It was in this moment of quiet disappointment that Leo's eyes fell upon the young cellist. She was still standing there, looking small and alone. A thought popped into Leo's head. It was a mixture of pity and a teacher's desire to include her. He walked over to her, offering a friendly smile. "Rough night, huh?" he said. "Don't worry, you'll get more chances to practice with the group." She turned from the window and gave him a small, quiet smile in return. The conductor joined them, still looking troubled. "That opening solo is just so important," he muttered, almost to himself. It was then that Leo had his idea. It wasn't a mean idea. In his mind, it was a way to make her feel part of the team, to include her in their problem. He turned to her, his tone gentle and slightly playful. "You know," he said, nodding towards her cello, "you've been studying that music so intently for weeks. I see you following along every night." He gave a light, encouraging chuckle. "Do you think you could maybe play the first few notes for us? Just the opening phrase, so our conductor here can at least remember how it's supposed to sound. We don't have our soloist, but we have you." He fully expected her to shrink back. He expected a nervous shake of the head, a quiet, "Oh, I couldn't," or an admission that it was too difficult. He was prepared to tell her it was okay, that there was no pressure. This was, for him, just a simple, kind gesture to a beginner, a way to make her feel involved in a night that had otherwise been a total loss. The conductor looked at Leo, then at the young woman, a faint, curious hope in his eyes. There was a long pause. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain. She didn't look at Leo. Her gaze was on her cello case, which rested on a chair nearby. For a moment, Leo thought she hadn't heard him, or that she was too shy to even answer. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked first at the conductor, and then her eyes met Leo's. The nervousness he was used to seeing in her seemed to have melted away. It was replaced by a calm, steady stillness. It wasn't a look of confidence, but something deeper, more solid. It was a look of quiet decision. She didn't speak. She didn't nod or smile. She simply walked over to the chair, placed her hand on the latches of her cello case, and with a soft click opened them. The sound of the rain seemed to fade into the background. The only thing Leo and the conductor could hear was the soft rustle as the young woman lifted her cello from its case. It wasn't a new instrument. In the dim light of the hall, Leo could see the wood was old, dark, and rich with a deep, warm glow. It was covered in the small scratches and marks of an instrument that had been loved and played for a very long time. This was no beginner's practice cello. She settled into the chair, moving it slightly to position herself. Her movements were not hesitant or nervous anymore. They were smooth, practiced, and full of a quiet purpose. She positioned the cello against her body curving around it as if it were a part of her. She tightened the bow, her fingers checking the tension with a quick, expert twist. Then she reached for a small, dark block of rosin and drew the bow across it a few times. The soft, gritty sound was the only noise in the large, empty room. Leo and the conductor stood perfectly still, watching. The conductor had a look of mild curiosity. Leo, however, was starting to feel a small, strange feeling in his stomach. This wasn't the careful, uncertain preparation he was used to seeing from her. This was the ritual of a professional. This was the calm before the storm. She closed her eyes for a moment. She took a slow, deep breath, her shoulders relaxing. She wasn't just getting ready to play a few notes. She was preparing. She was centering herself. The air in the room grew thick and heavy with waiting. Then she opened her eyes. She placed the bow on the string, and she drew it. The note that came out was not a sound. It was a feeling. It was a deep, low note that seemed to start in the very center of the cello and vibrate outwards, filling every corner of the silent hall. It wasn't loud, but it was incredibly powerful. It was a rich, dark, velvety tone that wrapped around Leo and the conductor and held them completely still. Leo felt his breath catch in his throat. His heart seemed to skip a beat. This was not the thin, scratchy sound of a beginner. This was a sound of breathtaking beauty and authority. It was a tone he had only ever heard from world-class musicians on expensive recordings. It was impossible that it was coming from her quiet, ordinary-looking cello in this dusty old hall. The note hung in the air, pure and perfect, and then it melted into the next one. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling a story. Her bow arm moved with a grace and control that was hypnotic. Her left hand danced on the fingerboard, her fingers finding each note with absolute precision, adding a gentle vibration, a life that made the melody weep and sing. She played the opening solo, the very one the conductor had been desperate to hear, and as she played, the music was no longer just notes on a page. It was sadness and hope. It was a memory of something beautiful that was lost. It was a quiet strength in the face of a storm. The melody rose and fell, each phrase more beautiful and heartbreaking than the last. Leo could not move. He could not speak. He could only stand there and listen. The patronizing smile had vanished from his face long ago, replaced by a look of utter shock. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with what his ears were telling him. All his assumptions, all his gentle, pitying thoughts, all his kind advice, it all shattered into a million pieces with every stroke of her bow. He looked at her face. The shy, nervous girl was gone. In her place was a musician, completely lost in the world she was creating with her instrument. Her expression was one of deep feeling and intense focus. This was who she really was. This was the truth she had been hiding behind a wall of quietness. He felt a hot wave of shame wash over him. He had been so sure of himself. He had been so blind. He had mistaken her silence for emptiness. He had mistaken her humility for a lack of skill. The music swelled, filling the hall with its incredible sound, completely drowning out the noise of the rain outside. Leo felt a physical reaction. A shiver ran down his spine. His hands, which had held a violin for decades, began to tremble slightly at his sides. He was trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming, devastating beauty of the truth. He had assumed she was just a beginner, but he was in the presence of a master. The last note from the cello did not simply stop. It seemed to fade slowly, leaving a silence in the hall that felt different from before. This silence was full. It was heavy with the beauty of the music that had just been living in the air. The only sound that returned was the gentle patter of the rain, which now seemed quiet and peaceful, like it was also taking a moment to recover. The young woman lowered her bow. She let out a soft breath and her body relaxed. The intense focus on her face softened, and she gently rested her head against the scroll of her cello for just a second. Then, she slowly opened her eyes. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Leo was still frozen in place. The image of her playing was burned into his mind. The sound was still ringing in his ears. He looked at his own hands, the hands of a teacher who had thought he knew everything, and he saw they were still trembling. He had to swallow hard, his throat feeling tight with emotion. It wasn't just shame he felt anymore. It was a deep, profound awe. The conductor was the first to break the silence. He took a step forward, his eyes wide. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a miracle. That, He began, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, his voice filled with a reverence Leo had never heard from him before. "That was the most beautiful rendition of that piece I have ever heard. And I have heard many." He took another step closer, his gaze fixed on the cello. "May I?" he asked softly, pointing to the instrument. The young woman nodded quietly. The conductor leaned in, peering at the inside of the cello through the F-shaped sound hole. Leo watched as the conductor's eyes widened even more. He straightened up, looking at the young woman with a new level of understanding. "I thought so," the conductor whispered, almost to himself. He turned to Leo, who was still trying to find his voice. "Leo," the conductor said, his tone full of meaning. "Do you see this?" Leo, feeling like he was in a dream, walked closer. He leaned down and looked where the conductor was pointing. There, inside the body of the old cello, was a small, neatly written signature. The ink was faded with age, but the name was one that anyone who loved string instruments would know immediately. It was the name of one of the most famous cello makers in history, a man whose instruments were priceless treasures, played only by the greatest musicians in the world. The air left Leo's lungs. The ordinary-looking scratched case, the old worn cello. It wasn't a beginner's instrument. It was a masterpiece. He had been giving advice about root notes and relaxed wrists to a musician who owned and played an instrument of that caliber. He finally found the strength to look at her face. All the pieces clicked into place. The quietness wasn't shyness. It was a desire for privacy. The careful preparation wasn't uncertainty. It was the respect of a master for her craft. She hadn't been hiding a lack of talent. She had been hiding an overwhelming amount of it. I don't understand," Leo finally managed to say, his voice rough. "Who are you?" She looked from the conductor's amazed face to Leo's stunned and humbled one. A faint, gentle smile touched her lips. "I just love to play," she said simply. "I moved here for a quiet life. I didn't want any attention. I just wanted to play music with others, to be part of an orchestra again in a simple way." She looked down at her cello, stroking its neck with a loving hand. It's easier to listen when you're quiet. And in that moment, Leo understood everything. He had been so busy talking, so busy teaching, that he had forgotten how to truly listen. He had been so focused on the role of the mentor that he had failed to see the artist standing right in front of him. The conductor was full of questions, asking her about her training, her past. She answered quietly, briefly, still protecting her privacy. Leo didn't hear most of it. He was lost in his own thoughts. He thought about all the times he had offered her simple advice. He thought about the picture he had painted of her in his head, the shy, struggling beginner. He felt a deep heat of embarrassment, but it was followed by a cooler, clearer feeling, humility. He walked up to her. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw no barrier between them. He wasn't looking at a student. He was looking at a fellow musician, one of immense talent. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice sincere and low. "I misjudged you completely." She shook her head, her smile still gentle. "You were only trying to be kind," she said. "And you were. Thank you for that." Her forgiveness, given so easily, made his eyes feel wet. He nodded, unable to find more words. The storm had passed. The rain had almost stopped. The three of them packed up in a comfortable, understanding silence. As they walked out of the hall together, the air outside was fresh and clean. Leo carried his violin case, but he felt like he was carrying a new lesson, one much more important than any he had ever taught. He had learned that talent doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits quietly in the corner, until the moment is right to share its breathtaking gift. And he had learned that no matter how much you think you know, there is always, always more to learn. The opening note had left him trembling, but the silence that followed had changed him forever.